So I'd like to introduce Oswald Kuyler from the International Chamber of Commerce Digital Standards Initiative. He's the managing director. And I'm going to open with a question, and then really, Oswald, I'm going to sort of hand over the floor to you. But earlier at the closing of the panel with Standard Chartered, Contour and TradeLens, I said we have to get them all in a room, along with all the central banks, the ports, the customs and revenue authorities across Africa. And they're only allowed to leave once we've sort of solved this digital trade, right? Of course, we all know it's a journey and it's not going to happen overnight, but it was my way of convincing them to sort of come to Nairobi. But that said, certainly for now, the private sector is taking on a lot of the initiatives to push for digitalization, right? If anything, they're ahead of the public sector, whether it's trade finance or logistics or, what I really would like for you to talk about is, the nuts and bolts of this, right? So the universal standards, the processes, how we're going to connect these digital islands that we were talking about earlier, and how we're going to reduce costs for everyone. That has come up more than once. That will mean reducing margins for the intermediaries, but I think at the end of the day, we just want more trade to be happening. And how do we improve the customer experience? So yes, please tell us about the Digital Standards Initiative. Oswald, over to you.
Oh, Oti, I am so aligned to you. Let's get everyone in a room in Nairobi, and I think in a week we'll make a lot of progress. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it really is an absolute privilege to join all of you today. And there's quite a few people actually in the previous panel that I'm hoping to reach out to potentially after this session. I've actually prepared a few slides, so I do apologize for that. I won't spend too much time on the slides, but what I wanted to do with the slides is give you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing, and then more importantly, also address that question, which is, if we got X, all of X in a room, and we actually started agreeing on a few things, would we actually see the pie grow? And I'll try my best not to talk too much so that hopefully we can get some questions. So there we go, share screen. Now you should see Melbourne. There we go. I think Artie's laughing, so I think that's Melbourne. So we started the Digital Standards Initiative in September last year, and the reason we started the project was because during the pandemic, we had a look at trade digitization, and we realized that even after 22 years of people trying to digitize trade processes, using organizations like Bolero and Estox and all these hyperledger and blockchain solutions, when you actually spoke to the actual carriers and you had a look at the actual presentation, how many documents, bills of lading, for example, were actually digitized in December last year, the number was fairly insignificant. Some people reported at 0.1%, others reported at 1%, but I think we can all agree that whether it's 0.1 or 1%, it's not enough. There's a major problem after 2 decades. So we started a project with the assumption that the whole world agrees that ultimately we're going to get off paper. And what I'm going to do now is I'll spend 5 minutes on the slides because I know we don't have a lot of time, and then hopefully get 1 or 2 questions in. So a lot of people ask, well, why does standards matter? Why did we start the Digital Standards Initiative to try and help solve this challenge? And what we explain to people a lot is we say, when you think about organizations themselves, when they try to become more productive, focus on how to improve margin, it was all about how do I do my business efficiently, effectiveness, and at the appropriate risk. I want to make sure whether I hire someone or I purchase something, that I fundamentally have a streamlined process that always gets me the result that I fundamentally need. And so what a lot of organizations did, standardized processes, standardize how do I hire, how do I fire, how do I buy, et cetera, and standardized data. And we all saw a lot of the opportunities that came from that, the productivity opportunities. We saw collaboration, business process management, we saw analytics project, all of these wonderful things came out when we went away from the physical cabinet at the office to digital solutions and standards that actually helped us execute and achieve similar results. So when we look at the external organization, it's a bit tricky, because when you think about one company, you know, the CEO can decide we're going to use SharePoint. But when you actually extend across company borders, there's no one person who ultimately decides we're all going to use one platform to execute trade. There's a lot of different platforms out there. And so we're trying to achieve the same thing. We're saying, how do we as a collective community become more efficient? But if every single fintech platform out there have their own little, you know, mechanism for digitizing an electronic bill of lading, you know, how do we navigate that complexity? It's not very efficient, because even when you try to integrate them, you have to translate the data every single time. The legal entity in one system, is it the same as the legal entity in another system? If the EBL has been collaborated up to this process in system A, what happens if it actually has to go to another system because the customer's bank is not on the same platform? So the reality is we need to standardize a lot of these things that we engage with in the broader community, so that it becomes easier and simpler for us to share that information. So what we did was we had a look at what's everyone doing and what should we ultimately do to try and address this problem. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of this, but I'll leave you with 3 thoughts. The first is, when we spoke to carriers, banks, exporters, and we asked them, what is the actual process that you're using to create a physical bill of lading today? What is it that you're using to negotiate the actual sale today? Most of them were saying, we're not in a fancy fintech. We're using all of our own local infrastructure, but we would love to know what are the standards that we can use, so that when we want to use an electronic file, we can actually prepare and issue that. So instead of having to join a fintech to create an EBL, is there a standard that we can use as a carrier or as a shipper to actually digitize it? Same with banks. The banks went, how do I onboard 25 different fintechs? Is there a standard that I can fundamentally onboard in my operating model, so that when I have to deal with a letter of credit process and I have to look at a commercial invoice or a title document, if there's a standard, it's easier and cheaper for me to actually integrate into that op model. So we realized we had to make it easier to find standards. We had to solve the second problem, which was make it legal to digitize documents like title documents, by pushing legislative reforms internationally, so that electronic records had the same equivalence in the law as physical documentation. We knew that not a single company can solve that. We all need to collectively stand up, work with governments and say, this is something you can do. And then finally, at the bottom portion, yes, there were some great standards already out there for legal entity identification, etc., but there weren't really any standards, or at least standards that were adopted on title documents. So we needed to get the BIMCOs and the FIATAs and all of these organizations of the world to produce these standards, so that both fintechs can adopt them and speak the same language when it comes to these title documents, but also the companies who don't necessarily want to use a fintech in Europe and they want to potentially produce their own company to actually help them digitize trade, can use the same technology to do that. So I'll leave you with a final thought, because I know I've been talking a lot. There's a lot of standards out there. We have a website for it, but coming back to Artie's final point of, can't we all just get into a room? My reality is, what I find us all in a situation today where there's mass collaboration on this. The carriers are actually working on the thing that they can really do, which is, how do I produce a title standard for EBLs? The banks are working on what are the changes we need to make, so that whether we do open account or LC processes, the rules are there to digitize. And so everyone's collectively working on it. The key becomes adoption. How do we drive adoption? And how do we get the funding required to modernize some of these custom import systems so that they can also integrate into the broader ecosystem? So I know I've been speaking a lot. I can generally talk for about an hour on this topic, but I hope I at least leave you with a little bit of collaboration, sharing of the standards, and enabling people who want to both digitize via fintech and those who don't. Anyway, if there is time for questions, I really wouldn't mind questions.
Well, I'm going to start with one. And I think what's really important is, yeah, how do we leverage the private sector across Africa? It's organized, right? It's not that we have to go to, every single SME or every single bank, or, we have, for example, the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. We obviously have a Chamber of Commerce at a national level in Kenya, and it'll be the same across the whole continent. I mean, in Nigeria, they've got a state level Chamber of Commerce, but they've also got the Nigerian Association of Manufacturers. And how do we really start engaging? Because I think having these top-down standards, very important, necessary, absolutely necessary. But the adoption, which you sort of mentioned, that's really only going to come when these sectoral organizations feel that they're part of it, right? So how do we do that?
So I have two thoughts, and if please, anyone who doesn't align to it, please share your thoughts in the chat. It would be awesome getting some diverse views on this. So I think it's two things. One is it's working through associations like BIM, Kofi Atiyata, who actually have quite a global membership basis, and going through those processes to create the standards. Very similar, when ICC updates, for example, its e-rules, we actually work with all of our chambers globally through drafting processes. So for example, when we created the Universal Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, and we launched that about a month ago, we got over 1,500 commentary from all across the globe saying this will work, this won't work, etc., etc. So to your point, we need that collaborative process to actually make sure that these work. We've seen when it's 5 people in a room trying to define a standard, doesn't happen, doesn't work, people don't feel engaged. I think the second portion is education. Even if I want to go and learn how to practically deploy a standard today, there's no online course that I can actually go to that teaches me how to use any of these standards. So one of the key things that we're starting to do is deploy centers of entrepreneurship globally, because our viewers, instead of just having 6 fintechs or 10 fintechs globally that really has the lion's share, our world is way more diverse than that. And every industry and every region is going to have its own flavor of how it wants to digitize trade, what it values. And by pushing the standards, through an educational process, my viewers will see hundreds of new fintechs that enable this. It's crazy for me as someone from South Africa that when I even have conversations around how we digitize an EBL, most of the solutions out there is from 3 countries. And the world is just too diverse for that. We're not going to scale if there's only 3 options for digitization.
Super. And we still have Akos and Leonard in the room. And I think you obviously heard about Akos growing her business and some of the challenges she's come across. You had Leonard sort of talking about, I think sometimes we're going to have to sort of drag the lawmakers along and also perhaps streamline some of the legislative processes and make sure that if a Ministry of Finance or if a central bank decides something, that it's not in conflict with some of these sort of trade agreements. But what would you say to the likes of, the young, ambitious, next generation business like AfriBeauty Collective, or like we've just had Spring Valley join us. We've got AfriCorp. So these are businesses based in Kenya, Nigeria, but global domination awaits, right? So how? So when you talk about education, right? I know that we have on the conference platform, there's an organization called Supply Chain Academy, actually based out of South Africa, but with an Africa remit. How can we just make sure that this goes through all possible channels?
So there's a few items there, and I must say, Akos, I hope we can actually connect after this session. So there's 3 views in my mind. So the first is on the public sector. We need to mobilize a lot more efficiently on the public sector, and we need to do it in 2 different ways. The very first one is what we've started to do is construct what we call a legal reform board. And on that, having the Africa Free Continental Trade Group, having ASEAN, the Commonwealth, all of these different organizations sitting around the same table and say, look, there's some legislative changes that we all collectively need to digitize. Let's work together to do so. And we engage on these one-on-one at the moment quite successfully, but we need to become more efficient. We cannot wait another 20 years for us to actually get some of the legislative changes. The second one I would add is leveraging our multilateral banks in more proactive ways. So what do I mean? One of the first things I did was I had a look at the multilateral banks and I looked at what was actually on their digital infrastructure agendas. I mean, these banks invest billions of dollars annually. And the reality is there's not a lot there because most companies, especially most fintechs, cannot wait 18 months to get a grant. It just doesn't happen. So how do we proactively actually go and say, you know what, digitization of trade is beneficial for all these different reasons. So one of the things that we've started doing, and you would have seen this last week, for example, we released what is the business case for trade digitization for G7 countries. And what you'll see is we'll be releasing even more and more reports. The G7 one alone was $9 trillion over 5 years. And we're working with a few that I can't mention now. That's also going to cover some of the countries in your region. And so making that case that this is collectively good and then using the multilateral banks to both help us upgrade our ports and our customs agencies, but then also help seed the organizations and the talent in Africa. And the final thing I'll say, because I know we're short on time, but in my interview, so I report to our Secretary General for the World Business Organization. What I told him is the thing that motivates me is, honestly, I want to live in a world where someone who sits in Africa, like I did in South Africa, who comes up with, let's say, an engineering drawing, can sell that somehow to someone in Australia at a mine site who 3D prints out that piece of equipment or whatever it might be and extract the economic rent. We should not have physical location hold back talent. That should not be the future that we live in. So I get excited because I know we can digitize trade. I know we can solve the title documents, all of these things with the appropriate legislation. But what makes me even more exciting is what that infrastructure will do for us to connect our talent in Africa to the rest of the world. And I think it's going to be magical. Sorry. I go off on a tangent.
No, but that's I think that's really important, and we're going to be talking about this actually in a few minutes. Outsourcing of services, and I think it is the maybe the pandemic has helped people think about this a bit more. Remote working and having talent and therefore trade in services as much as sort of physical goods.